I have a very simple project here, and the whole purpose of this project is just to discuss organization of your projects. So very simple. So I press this button, add stuff, and it says enter the first number to add. You enter a number, and then it says enter the second number, you add a different number, and then it just tells you what their sum is. So not a very fascinating project at all, but the whole point of this is to just kind of discuss organizing projects. So let's look inside this project. So there are actually 3 sprites here, one for the button, add stuff, and one for Scratchy, and then this kind of invisible one. So this costume here, this sprite here does not have a costume, but it does have some script. So let me just talk about what I've got here. So what I did was, for the sprites, only things that relate to sprites are in that particular code. So things that relate to sprites are like changing costumes, reacting to some kind of button click or something like that. So for example, if I wanted to change what Scratchy is saying or thinking, or perhaps a costume change for an animation, I would do that in the script relating to that sprite, and the same thing for the button. Now, things that don't relate to the sprite themselves, I'm going to put in this blank sprite right here. And so let's just kind of look at what they're doing. So this button, all that I have here is when this sprite is clicked. So whenever somebody clicks on this button, it broadcasts a message. So it doesn't do anything else other than say, oh, somebody clicked me, and I'm going to let the sprite or code know that this happened, and it should respond. So I've got a little message here, tell Scratchy to add stuff. So that is woken up over here in the Scratchy sprite because I want Scratchy to talk now. So that's why I'm giving it to Scratchy. So he's going to ask you to enter the first number, and then he's going to ask you to enter the second number. And what this does, its whole purpose is to set these 2 variables, add 1 and add 2. So it's just setting them. Now what happens after that, and I'm going to separate it out so we can see it a little better, is this broadcast statement. So I'm broadcasting a message called add numbers, and I'm going to wait for that to finish. So I don't know in this sprite what exactly that does, but hopefully the name gives me a clue that I'm adding things. But I don't do the actual add here. I don't do the actual processing. I'm having that done somewhere else, not in my sprite. Now when that is done and I'm finished with my wait, it actually is the thing that is setting this sum variable, this one right here. And then I have this big join to get that message, because again, I want Scratchy to talk. So that's the say, and it relates to that sprite. So that's why it's in here. So what happens then is, where is that add numbers? That's where my blank sprite comes into play, because the add numbers has nothing to do with the sprites itself. All it is I have 2 variables, set a 3rd variable. So I do that away from sprite stuff. And why would I do this? Why don't I just put it in the Scratchy sprite or even the add button sprite, which I could have, and it would have worked fine in Scratch to do that. But I wanted to be very clear that this is separate from sprite processing. It has nothing to do with sprites. And by doing this, by separating this out, I allow this to have more freedom. So let's say in the future, I'm like, oh, I don't really want to add them. Maybe I wanted their average. So I don't have to change the user interface at all. I can just go in here and write code to take an average. Or if there's anything else more complex I wanted to do with it, I could have created something to create that final join string also. Maybe I could have done that here as well, because it doesn't exactly relate to the sprites. So I could have put that here. So any processing that doesn't exactly relate to sprites, I can do separately. And so the advantage of that is this complex processing is separate from my user interface. And that's good, because once I love my user interface, I can focus more on this, or vice versa. Maybe I focus more on this and then develop my user interface, which is how I approach this, because this is a terrible user interface. If you look at it, I have no checking that these are valid entries that the user is putting in here. It's a terrible user interface. So what this does is it allows me to kind of create what I call a little stub, just a little something to get me going to do the kind of the big deal part of the project, which is to do the adding. And then I'm going to go back later and deal with my user interface. So I can change this in many ways any way I like, in the most creative way I can think of if I wanted to. All I have to make sure I do is that add 1 and add 2 are set before I broadcast this message. So it gives you that nice separation. It gives you a little more freedom to not mess up your code. If you have something working, and obviously this is very simple, but imagine it was kind of complicated what you needed to do. It won't get messed up if you want to just play around with creating an interesting user interface, and vice versa. If you love your user interface and you don't want it to get messed up, you can just keep this all separate. So it's a recommended path for you to take. It's very common in other languages as well to kind of keep the user interface and the actual processing and other things as well kind of separate and from each other as a good organization method. So anyway, I hope this was a helpful video to give you some ideas about organizing your projects. And as always, thanks for listening.